Hello, Vikings. Welcome to Arts and Music Wednesday. I'm Russell Lee, and for the next hour or so, I will be your host. So, who the heck am I? Well, in a previous life, I was an executive speechwriter here in Silicon Valley, California, and these days, I'm one of your guest enrichment lecturers on Viking Ocean cruises. If you've never been on a Viking Ocean cruise, there are always 3 or 4 of us on every ship. Our job is to add insight and education about all the ports that you're visiting. So, for instance, the story I'm going to tell today would normally be presented in the Netherlands, which you would visit on maybe Viking shores and fjords or trade routes in the Middle Ages. Now, I'm very sorry that we're not all together on a ship right now, but at least Viking.TV gives us a chance to have a quieter, more relaxed one-on-one conversation. The only thing we're missing is the interactivity. And so this is what I'd like to do about that. If you're watching this live, you'll notice that on the right side of your screen, there's an area where you can submit questions. Now, you can certainly use that to submit questions, and I'll see how many I can get to at the end of the presentation. But I'd also like you to use that to share any comments, feedback, insights, or even stories you may have about what I talked to today. Now, in addition, let me give you some incentive. Throughout today, I'll be throwing out various little trivia questions to test your knowledge, and I'll try to give credit to the first person who gets the correct answer. So you can use the feedback for that. And here's a hint. If you pre-fill out your name and all the other information, then you're all set to go when I throw out a trivia question, okay? And if you don't want to participate, don't worry about that. There is no test at the end. There's no obligation. All you need to do is find a comfy chair, your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. So, are you ready to hear a great story? Today, we're going to talk about Tulip Mania, the bulb that sprouted the first stock market bubble. This story, of course, has art in it, but it also has history, politics, economics. It has intrigue and suspense. And most of all, it has outrageous, arrogant stupidity. Lots of stupidity. So let's get started, shall we? What I'd like to do is set the context. So what we're going to do is go back almost 500, 600 years. So let's hop in the Wayback Machine, all right? Welcome to Europe in the mid-1500s. What's going on in the world today? Well, we're in one of the biggest upheavals in Western civilization history. It is called the Reformation. The Catholic Church has pretty much dictated policy for the past 1,000 years. But all of a sudden, there's this new religion, the Protestant religion, that's threatening to upheave everything. And the country we're focusing on today, which is the Netherlands, is not immune to that. So let's zoom in on the Netherlands here. There we go. Okay, so let me give you a more detailed map of the Netherlands. And what you'll see here is that it's actually, at this point, divided into 17 independent provinces that are all jointly together called the Netherlands. I've got my little official Serrano clicker here from San Felipe, and let me see if I can get my graphics to match up with what I'm saying, not get ahead of myself. So let's go on to the next graphic. And there we are. Okay, good. All right. So these are the 17 independent provinces, and this will bring up for background my first trivia questions. Okay, so first question is, these are called the Netherlands. Why are they called the Netherlands? And I'll go ahead and confess while you're filling out your answers that there's about a 30 to 60 second lag before I see your responses. So rather than just sit here and wait 60 seconds, I'll give you a couple of seconds to type in your responses, and I'll go on and then I'll catch up with your responses later. Okay, does that sound fair? So if you've submitted your answers, the correct answer is that nether means low or under. For instance, the term netherworld. So Netherlands literally means low countries. Okay, that brings up the second trivia question is, all right then, why are these called the Low Countries? And again, I'll give you a couple of seconds to fill out your answers for that, and then I'll retrieve them on my tablet. Okay, so the answer is they're called the Low Countries because they're literally below sea level. That's why you see in this area all the dikes, the canals, the polders, things like that. It's below sea level. Okay, now, third question is, why are these people called the Dutch? Why aren't they called Netherlanders or Hollanders? Why are they called the Dutch? Okay, so you've got those three questions. You're welcome to type in responses. Again, a little bit later in the program, I'll come back and revisit these so that I don't interrupt the story for right now. Okay, so the correct answer is Dutch is an Old English word that simply means people or country. So they called themselves the Dutch, meaning we call ourselves the people. There's actually a more modern translation of that. If you think of the country of Germany, in German it is called Deutschland. That's the same word. Deutsch means the people or the country. So Deutschland means land of the people. Okay, so let's go back to our story on the Netherlands and these 17 independent provinces. At this point in time, the Netherlands is not an independent country. It is actually provinces that belong to Habsburg Spain. And this gentleman, the next graphic. This is King Philip II of Habsburg Spain. This is the same King Philip who married Henry VIII's eldest daughter, Mary, who later became known as Bloody Mary because of the Reformation and the war between the Catholics and the Protestants. This is the same Philip II who tried sending his Spanish Armada against England and got completely wiped out by Queen Elizabeth. Okay, so that's this Philip II. But right now he's got another problem because Spain is very, very Catholic, and the Netherlands is slowly embracing Protestantism, particularly the north. The northernmost 7 provinces of the Netherlands decide that they are going to become Protestant instead of Catholic. And so for one of the first times in history, a province or 7 provinces declare their independence from their mother country. Unheard of before. Well, Philip II does not react very kindly to this. So as the next graphic shows, he decides to take his army in 1568, go back in and stomp down this independence movement. This would become known as the Dutch War of Independence, or as this next caption shows, it was also known historically today as the 80 Years' War. Now, no sooner does Philip start reclaiming some of those lower provinces that had declared independence when another war breaks out all over Europe. This one we know today as the 30 Years' War. And the 30 Years' War started out as a war in Europe between Protestants and Catholics, but it then devolved in these petty squabbles between every European country that had a bone to pick with every other European country. So you may not know it, but the 80 Years' War and the 30 Years' War were happening at the same time, and poor Philip II and the Netherlands were caught in the middle of it. So after 80 years or 30 years, depending on how you're counting, all the participants finally decided to get together and say, you know, let's stop killing people. Let's try to settle this peacefully. And so the result in 1648 was the Treaty of Westphalia, where everybody sat down at the table and hashed out what they wanted and what they needed. And this effectively ended 2 wars. So what did the Treaty of Westphalia accomplish? Well, this next graphic shows you what Europe looked like in 1618 at the beginning of the 30 Years' War. Now watch closely, especially the area that looks like Germany, because I'm going to animate this and we're going to see what it looks like now in 1648 after the Treaty of Westphalia. So the Holy Roman Empire, which is what occupied Germany at this time, was split into 300 different independent sovereign states. Switzerland gained its independence. Calvinism became an accepted religion in addition to the Catholics and the Lutherans. But most of all, for our story, Netherlands was declared an independent country, recognized by Spain, or at least partially. Let's zoom in again on that area of the Netherlands. So what we have here is actually 2 countries. At the top, the greenish brown, the darker area, are those 7 provinces that broke away. That became known as the Dutch Republic or the Free Dutch Republic. That yellow area down at the bottom, the other part of the Netherlands, that became known as the Spanish Netherlands, still Catholic, still under the control of Philip II. So between North and South, the North or Free Dutch Netherlands developed 2 gigantic advantages over the rest of Europe at this point in time. The first one had to do with the fact that they were Protestant. They had this thing called the Protestant work ethic, where they felt that the path to heaven was through hard work and education, as opposed to confessing your sins and forgiveness. So you had this work ethic all up north. What happened as a result of that was that there were still some Protestants living down in the Spanish Netherlands, And King Philip II said to them, I'll give you two choices. You can either convert to Catholicism, or you can get out of my country. And so all the Protestants got out of his country and went north. So a huge amount of the Netherlands brain trust left the Spanish Netherlands and went north. So that's the first huge advantage that the Dutch Netherlands had. The second advantage is in this next graphic. And this brings, I'm sorry, before we get to that next graphic, I said I was going to talk about art for Arts and Music Wednesdays. This is a painting called Fishing for Souls. And to explain this painting, if you look on the left, you'll see the Free Dutch Netherlanders. You can tell that because they're all wearing black and have these ruffled colors that you see in the old paintings. On the right, you see the Catholics. You can tell that because they're wearing the bright red robes. And so what they are literally doing is going to the area in between and fishing for souls. Who you went with determined what you considered your salvation and what country you ended up in. On the left, the Dutch Netherlands, or on the right, the Spanish Netherlands. Okay, so again, that was one huge advantage, was that a lot of the brain trust went to the Dutch Netherlands. Now we'll get to that next image, which will show what the second advantage was. And this brings up my next trivia question. Now, I'll confess, the trivia question is not, what are these? Okay, I'll go ahead and give that away. These are windmills. My trivia question is, why did these provide such a huge advantage to the Dutch Netherlands? I'll give you a few seconds to respond to that. And while we do that, I've got my handy dandy tablet here, and let me see if we've got anything input from what's happening so far. Okay, so what I see is that the first right answer on the Netherlands was from Janine in Baskin Ridge. So congratulations to you. Unfortunately, nobody quite knew what the Dutch was. So you all learned something today. So I see a lot of people, the lowlands, the farlands, Art, Janine, Nancy, Tiffany. Thank you for responding. This is great. I love the interactivity. It knows that you're out there listening. Okay, so you've had enough time to respond to this. What advantage did windmills give to the Dutch Netherlands? Keep in mind that we are at the beginning of the industrial age, where machinery is starting to enter and take over the world. Steam has not yet become a ubiquitous force in England, so all they rely on is human power. Except in this case, the windmill gave the Dutch unlimited power. Think about that. It never gets tired. You never run out of people. You have unlimited power. So you have this Dutch work ethic. You have these Dutch windmills. And you combine this with the invention on this next slide, and you are unbeatable. So what is this image on the next slide? Again, let me let my graphics catch up here. This is something that was invented during this time. This is called a wind-powered saw. This gave them unlimited energy to build and build and build. It is absolutely amazing. So that's what the Dutch did. They built. But they didn't just build any old thing. They built what's in the next graphic. They built ships. They built ships. And when I say they built ships, that's reflected in this next painting from the Dutch Golden Age. They built ships like crazy. Okay, and this actually will animate across. So let's actually see the full scope of this painting. Okay, so until this point in time, this was the age of naval exploration. The Portuguese and the Spanish ruled the seas. At this point in time, the Dutch were able to surpass them and become the leading shipbuilders and naval navigators in the Western world. And this ushered in what this next slide shows as what we call today the Dutch Golden Age. For over 100 years, the Dutch had the highest per capita income anywhere in the world. This became an absolutely rich country because of the ships and the shipbuilding. And a major part of that is a company that's in the next slide. It was called the Dutch East India Company. Many of you may have heard of that. The Dutch East India Company was somehow able to get a government contract for exclusive trading rights with the Far East for 200 years. Imagine that. All this silk, cloth, gold, porcelain, pottery, Everything spices coming from the East were exclusively controlled by the Dutch East India Company. This was a huge, huge company. How big was this company? Well, let's do a comparison with modern times. There's a graph outline I'm going to show on the next slide. Okay, and this is going to lead me to my next trivia question for you. Today, in the world, there are 4 public companies that have had a market capitalization or company value of more than $1 trillion. A huge, huge amount of money, $1 trillion. Can you name those 4 companies? And while I'm waiting for that, I'll go ahead and check in on my old friend, the tablet again, and see what kind of answers are coming in there. Okay, so what we've got is, hey, okay, Gene from St. Louis, you said that the windmills help pump out water. Well, that is true, and that is a use of energy, but the answer I was looking for was unlimited power, which I apologize, it was a very specific answer I was looking for. Okay, so now you've had time to talk about who these 4 companies are. Let me go ahead and indicate that. Okay, so let's go ahead and paint this graphic here. Those 4 companies are Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google. In fact, based on last week's earnings, Apple is predicted to very soon pass the $2 trillion mark. That is an amazing value for a company, $2 trillion. However, if we look at this in historical context and we take some older companies and convert them into what their value would be in modern dollars, we will see that these 4 companies are not the be-all and end-all. So let me go ahead and paint this next animation. What you'll see is that historically, there were 4 companies who actually were larger than these 4 dot-com companies. You can see that the Mississippi Company actually approached almost $7 trillion in today's money. But to get back to our story, all of these dwarf in comparison to the Dutch East India Trading Company. Let's put them on the graph. So the Dutch East India Company was worth more than $7 trillion. An amazing amount of money. That's between 4 to 8 times the size of these Alphabet, Microsoft, Amazon, and Apple companies. Let me give you another pictorial to capture this in another way, okay? So this is a picture of the relative size of the Dutch East India Company, called VOC in the Dutch acronym, okay? Now let's compare that to modern day companies, and go ahead and swipe that animation over. That is correct. VOC is the size of the top 20 modern companies put together. We are talking about a market valuation of almost $8 trillion. This is why the Dutch became so absolutely rich. And as a result of this, the Netherlands invented modern economics and finance as we know it today. For instance, they were the first ones to develop this. This is a stock certificate. The VOC was the first publicly traded multinational company in modern times. With a stock certificate, you bought a certain percentage ownership of the company, and in return, you got a certain percentage of the profits. The Dutch also developed this next thing. This is the first bond. A bond is where you lend some money to the company so that they can do expansion, and then they pay you back that money with interest. The Netherlands developed the first one of these. This is a stock exchange where you could buy and sell stock shares in the East India Company. Amsterdam in the Netherlands had the first one of these. This is the precursor to the modern central bank, something that is still with us today. But during this time, during the Dutch Golden Age, the Netherlands developed and innovated something absolutely unheard of before that is still with us today. And that is this next graphic. The Dutch invented or created the middle class. And this painting is called, what is it called? It's called Portrait of a Family. And what this shows is the emergence of a middle class where you no longer had to be a noble to be successful. You just had to be a good investor. So we talk today about dot-com millionaires, Google millionaires. Imagine having invested in a company that was 4 times the size of Apple. These people became filthy rich. And just like we do today, if you got it, flaunt it. They wanted the fancy houses, the fancy clothes, the fancy silverware, the wall decorations. They were looking for all these status symbols, just like today we have the Tesla or the BMW, which of course you never park in your garage. You park it in the driveway because you want everybody to look at you and say, wow, this person is rich. So what kind of status symbols did the Dutch look for at this time? Well, there was one status symbol that stood out about all others, as this next graphic shows. It was the tulip. The tulip. And this painting is called Double Portrait of a Husband and Wife, and you can see a tulip and a tulip bulb right below featured very prominently. So why was the tulip such an important status symbol for the Dutch? Well, let's go into a little bit of background about the tulip. The tulip is not native to Europe. It actually grows at about 40 degrees north latitude throughout Eastern Europe. I'm talking Turkey, the Middle East, the Ukraine, Mongolia, even parts of China. So any tulip today that you see west of the Balkans is actually non-native. In fact, the word tulip itself comes from the Turkish word for turban, as this next graphic shows. So that's how we get the word tulip. So with all this trading going on back and forth between the East and the West, it was only a matter of time before a crop like the tulip started making its way over to Central Europe. And that was thanks to this next person. This next person is Carolus Clusius. He was a botanist at the University of Leiden in the Dutch Netherlands. And he is famous for having developed one of the first horticultural academies at the University of Leiden, and here's a picture of that. So he brought over tulips from Turkey and tried planting them, and he discovered, wow, these grow very well in this climate. As some of these rich Dutch people started visiting the academy, they said, look at that flower. I must have that flower. And so as this next graphic shows, the rich Dutch started planting tulips all over their front yards as a status symbol to basically say, look at me, I'm rich. You had red ones. If you had red ones, then you had to buy orange ones. If you had orange ones, you had to buy yellow ones. If you had yellow ones, you had to buy white ones. It's very hard today to consider how revolutionary this was at that point in time, but there's this little picture that I'm going to paint at the bottom shows. The tulip had never been seen before in Europe. And let me wait for my graphic to catch up here with there we go. Okay. It was bright. It was iridescent. It was sunny. It practically glowed in the dark. But most important, it was showy. It stood out. It said, look at me, which is what people wanted. Okay, so as this next graphic shows, even today, Holland is known as the tulip capital of the world, and it all started here. In fact, today, Holland grows 3 billion tulips a year, most of them exported to other countries. It is a huge trading good for Holland. But anyway, back to our story. Okay, so for this next graphic, you'll see that tulips became ubiquitous all over the rich. As I said, just having one color was not enough. You had to have all colors. You had to have the full set. But in 1635, something absolutely amazing happened. This tulip appeared on the scene. This tulip, as you'll notice, is not a solid color. It is striped. It was like a miracle from God, and it was extremely rare and unique. It was so rare that it earned its own name. It was called Semper Augustus, which means always summer. So let's take a closer look at this unusual tulip and what made it so. Okay, Semper Augustus, today we know that it's actually caused by a virus that infects the tulip. It's called the broken virus because it breaks the solid color genes and DNA of the tulip. But what's interesting is that looking at it from the outside and from the inside, the stripes look different. And when it infects a tulip, no two infected tulips look the same. It might be red on white. It might be yellow on white. It might be purple on red. It could be anything. But at the time, this was the only striped, non-solid tulip, and everybody who had money wanted to have one. Well, the guy who grew this tulip was a gentleman named Adrian Pau. And Adrian Pau knew a good thing when he saw it. He said, you know what? I'm the only guy who's got these. Everybody wants one. If I can control the industry and trade of this, I can make a lot of money. And he did. And this is what happened. So, as this next little animation shows, Adrian would sell his Semper Augustus to Craig for 100 Dutch guilders or florins. Craig would then turn around and sell this same tulip to his friend Mark for twice as much money, because Mark had to have it and it was the only one available. Now Mark would then turn around and sell this tulip to Jan, and he would also make a huge profit. And so the price for these rare striped tulips started just skyrocketing astronomically. Okay? And before you knew it, as this next graphic shows, these striped tulips started infecting other tulips, and all these different varieties came out. Each one was rare, each one was unique, and the people who had money had to have every one. It's like every year when a new iPhone comes out, you have to have the latest and the greatest, and the old one is considered just passé, right? Okay, so these started earning nicknames like Admiral, or Emperor, or Viceroy. And then, not to be outdone, the next guy to come along with a striped tulip would say, no, mine is called Emperor of Emperors, or Admiral of Admirals, or Viceroy of Viceroys. And they just kept going for the newest, the latest, the rarest, the most colorful striped tulips. And a lot of people made a lot of money. But there are two major flaws with this business plan for tulips. The first one is reflected in this next picture. Okay? Tulips grow from seeds. Now, a seed is what you call asexual reproduction. You need to have two parent tulips to make a child tulip using seeds. And for Adrian Pau's, who had this striped tulip, it might be that his tulip pollinated itself, in which case the baby would also be a striped tulip. But it might be that his striped tulip got pollinated by this other tulip across town that got wafted in the wind that maybe was an ordinary plain white tulip. And so the children of his next crop may all be plain white tulips. So it was impossible for him to predict what the next crop was going to be like and to control what his supply was going to be like. Fortunately, there is a second way that tulips can reproduce, as this next picture shows. Tulips can also reproduce by bulbs. A bulb is an asexual or non-sexual reproduction. A bulb is an exact clone of the plant that it came from. So as long as you reproduce from bulbs, you know you're going to get an exact copy of the tulip that you thought you were going to get. Another advantage is that with seeds, it could take 6 to 8 years before you get a tulip that springs flowers. That's a long time to wait for your inventory. Bulbs work instantaneously. But bulbs bring up the second problem with this business plan that I was going to talk about, and that's this. A bulb lays dormant in the ground for much of the winter, say through November, as this next picture shows. Let me wait for my graphic to paint. There you go. Okay, so it is not until the spring that a little plant starts bumping out of the ground, say about February so. Okay, by March, you've actually got a plant growing, and you know you've got a tulip back in season, and in April and May, it finally springs a flower. Because it grew from a bulb, you know exactly what color this tulip is going to be. But if you're trying to make a lot of money, and your market is only open for 2 months of the year, April and May, you've got a huge problem with cash flow and making any kind of ongoing profit. But there's an old saying that when a problem involves money, somebody is going to come up with a solution. And this is the solution they came up with. Another innovation from the Netherlands. It was this. It was the first stock market futures contract. And again, let me wait for the picture to paint of that. Okay, so this is a futures contract. And in order to understand a futures contract, we need to understand a lot about what takes place in trade today and how something that it was this innovative is just commonplace today. The best example I can think of is Amazon. Okay? When you go on to Amazon and you buy a book, you are not actually buying a book. You are buying a promise that Amazon is going to ship a book to you in 2 days or 2 weeks, or in the case of pre-orders, possibly a year. In return, you are not giving Amazon any money. Instead, what you are giving them is the promise that your credit card bank is going to transfer money to them. So you are actually not physically taking any goods, and you're not physically giving them any money. It is all based on trust. Now think how revolutionary this was in an age when you're used to going down to the market, slapping down your florins, and they hand you a fish. No, this is all based on trust. It's all based on futures. And so as this next graphic shows, they started trading not in tulip flowers, but in tulip bulbs that did not even exist yet. So in March, you might sign a futures contract for a bulb that was going to come out in November. The vendor promised to give you the bulb in November, and you promised to give them money in November, but nothing changes hands now. It's all the contract. So instead of trading flowers, people started trading bulbs. But even more so, instead of trading bulbs, they realized that the real value was in this contract, this piece of paper. And so they stopped even trading bulbs, they started trading contracts. And so as this next graphic shows, you started having in taverns these things that built up called colleges, where people would sit around, no money change hands, they just all buy rounds of drinks for each other, and they'd exchange contracts and promises. And I could take a contract from somebody and turn around to the next table and trade it to somebody else. And then they could turn around to the next table and trade it to somebody else. And so in the backs of these taverns, you develop what this next graphic shows. You develop these huge auction houses where somebody would raise their hand and say, I've got a bulb or I've got a contract. Let the bidding begin. And people would bid, 100 florins, 200 florins, 300 florins, 400 florins. They had people keeping track on logbooks of what was all happening. All these transactions were written down on official paperwork, and it was all based on trust. It was all based on futures. A lot of money was made during this time. And when a lot of money got made, it started from passing from the nobles and the millionaires down to the ordinary people like you and me. So as this next graphic shows, let's take a look at what happens when the riffraff enters the picture, okay? It started attracting people who knew nothing about tulips. All they knew was that there was some kind of get-rich-quick scheme, and they had to get in on it. So as the next bullet shows, the market started changing from quality to quantity. Instead of trading for a bulb, you started trading for lots of 50 bulbs. You didn't care what was in them, but they were bulbs and they were tulips, so they had to be worth something. Instead of trading for these expensive, rare, striped, broken tulips, you started trading for lots of ordinary orange tulips, or white tulips, or red tulips, simply because they were tulips. And again, there was a lot of money to be made. Okay, and as the next bullet point shows, okay, the price started increasing simply because people were expecting the price to increase. And tulips became part of society for the rich and the poor all over the place. Here's another painting from the Dutch Golden Age. Okay, this one is called, let me get my notes here, this one's called Kerkhoven and His Family. This is from the Dutch Golden Age, and if we zoom in on this painting a little bit, you'll see that this, like many other Dutch paintings from this time, featured tulips, either in the foreground or the background. And after we leave here, if you go and study a lot of the Dutch masters during this point in time, you will see tulips all over the artwork. Okay, so let's talk about how crazy this market started becoming. On this next graphic, I'll share a couple of stories. So in 1635, a lot of 40 bulbs sold for 100,000 florins, or Dutch guilders. And just for a perspective, 1 florin in today's money is equal to about $13. A ton of butter, and that's TUN. TUN ton is a liquid measurement that is about 240 gallons. A ton of butter would cost 100 florins, and a skilled laborer might earn between 150 to 350 florins a year. So for 40 bulbs to sell for 100,000 florins, that is a huge amount of money. Here's another example from 1636. Okay, in 1636, somebody for one of 2 existing Semper Augustus bulbs traded 12 acres of land. That is enough for an estate to live on. And again, tulips were being traded on the exchanges of Dutch cities all over the country. Trading was encouraged by all members of society, whether you had money or not, because it was all done on credit, it was all done on promises. If you bought a tulip bulb for 100 florins, you didn't have to hand over the 100 florins yet. All you had to do was turn over and sell the contract for 200 florins, and you never had to be out any money. So you could get rich without having any money in the first place. So people were mortgaging their houses, selling their possessions to get in on this tulip market. Another story example, even more extreme. This is in 1636 as well. Okay, so this is for, let me again wait for my graphic to catch up. Okay, so this is for a single viceroy flower. Okay, this earned 2 lasts of wheat. A last is another measurement. This is a solid measurement equal to about 1,700 pounds, so almost a ton. So this single viceroy went for 2 lasts of wheat, plus 4 lasts of rye, plus 4 fat oxen, plus 8 fat swine, plus 12 fat sheep, plus 2 hogsheads of wine, plus 4 tons of beer. Again, a ton is equal to 240 gallons, plus 2 tons of butter, plus 1,000 pounds of cheese. This is all for 1 flower. As well, they threw in a complete bed. They threw in a complete set of clothes. And they threw in a solid silver drinking cup. All told, this single flower sold for 2,500 Dutch florins. That is 10 times somebody's annual salary. You would have to work 10 years for this single flower. This was bought and sold simply because somebody thought they could get more for it by reselling it. One more example from 1636 to 1637. There was an auction to benefit 7 orphans. Okay? The only asset that their dead father left behind was 70 tulips. That went up for auction. But among those tulips was one extremely rare Admiral van Enkhuizen bulb. That bulb itself sold at auction for 5,200 florins. That was an all-time record. If you're keeping up with the math, that is 20 times somebody's annual salary. All told, this lot of 70 tulips sold for a total of 53,000 florins. Just keep that in mind as you're looking at how crazy this market became. Now, I don't know if you keep up with modern day economics, but in America we have a program called Mad Money, which is hosted by a guy named Jim Cramer. On his program yesterday, he was talking about the stock market that currently keeps going up, and he had a great quote, which I'm going to read off here. Jim Cramer said, "Never underestimate the power of enthusiastic buyers who don't have a clue what they're doing." And that is so apropos for what's going on right now. So anyway, let's get back to the story. So to put some perspective around what's going on in this crazy market, as this next graphic shows, we are basically talking about a tulip bulb. It is a little root that's like an onion. You can eat the thing. In fact, there's a story about one sailor who accidentally mistook a tulip bulb for an onion and ate it. He was chased down the street by the people who owned the bulb, and they actually had him thrown in jail. He was told, "That thing that you just ate, that could have outfitted your entire ship and your crew for a year." That's how much these things became worth. So let's talk again about this crazy market. Let's look at another piece of artwork. This is a painting that is called Wagon of Fools. And let's talk about what's in this painting. Okay, in the center left, you see everybody is following the goddess Flora, the goddess of flowers. She's got a tulip flag and she's holding tulips in her hand. The wagon is occupied by people drinking and carousing, having a good time because they're trading tulips and they're becoming rich. Following closely behind the wagon are all the wannabes. They're the riffraff like you and me. They're trying to get on the wagon to participate in this great party. And you notice they've taken all their tools of the trade, their agricultural tools, their craftsman's tools, they've thrown them on the ground. They're abandoning everything in their normal life, selling off all their possessions because all they want to do is get on this wagon. And who is leading the wagon? On the far right, you see in the red dress, the goddess of fortune, Fortuna. Fortuna, you can tell, has two faces. Because you never know with fortune whether you're going to get a good outcome or a bad outcome. They're trusting everything to chance. So again, the goddess Flora and the goddess Fortuna. So let's take a look in summary of how this market was going on this graph on the next page. If you look at the left column going up 2, 4, 6, 10, 20, that is an incremental of the number of times from the last time. So if you had 1 and then you go to twice as much, you go up to 2. If you go to 10 times as much, you go to 10. And as you can see, this is not to scale. If I actually did this to scale, it would go up the top of your television screen. So this is what the price of tulips looked like through 1636. Even with this abbreviated graph, it looks like it almost goes straight up vertical. Now, you and I are smart people in the modern age. When we see a graph like this, we just know what's coming next. But at this point in time, people didn't know. There had never been a bubble before. For all they knew, it was simply prosperity and progress. They did not know that this was not sustainable through time. They just kept seeing the price go up. They saw prosperity, they saw trade, they saw tulips, they saw making money. So they had no idea anything else was going to happen. Now, you and I know that this is unsustainable and cannot go on forever. So when did that point in time happen? It happened on February 5th, 1637, in a town called Haarlem in the Netherlands. In one of these backroom taverns where they were holding an auction, somebody put a bulb up for sale and nobody bid on it. Immediately, panic took over the room. Everybody wanted their bulb or their contract to be the next auction because they wanted to get rid of this thing before the bottom fell out of the market. And what that did is that created a selling frenzy where all of a sudden everybody wanted to unload their tulips, their bulbs, and their contracts all at once. So in the space of one evening, in the space of just a couple of hours, the price of tulips fell 95%. And that's what that looks like on that graph. So what do you do if you're in this position? Well, let's take a look at a map, okay? So on this map, as I mentioned, Haarlem, which I'm going to circle in yellow here on this next transition. Haarlem, let me wait for that. Okay, there it is. Haarlem is about the center middle, okay? And that is where this took place. If you are smart, you immediately get on your horse and you ride out of town. You go to the next town where they haven't heard of this panic yet, and you unload all of your contracts before people know what's going on. And then if you're in that town and you see what's happening, you hop on your horse and you ride even farther out of town where they haven't heard of it yet, and you sell all of your contracts. And so what this did is this not only created a selling frenzy, but it helped the selling frenzy spread faster than it normally would have. And pretty soon it engulfed all of the Netherlands in this absolute panic and caused the bottom to fall out of the market. So as this next graphic shows, these auction houses became absolute madhouses of people screaming at the top of their lungs to get their stuff in the next auction. Over the course of just a couple of days, people lost their entire fortunes. And keep in mind, these are people who sold their houses, everything they owned, to try and speculate in this market. They didn't know better. They lost everything. Okay, so let's do a summary of what happened in this market by looking at another painting. This is a painting called, if we move on to the next graphic, Allegory of the Tulip Mania by Jan Bruegel the Younger. And yes, these are monkeys in this painting. Let's zoom in the lower left-hand corner and tell our story in summary. Here you see a noble. You can tell he's a noble monkey because he's got a sword. He is growing tulips that he grew in his garden. He's telling everybody, look at me, I'm rich. He's got his little contract. If we move a little bit farther to the right, you'll see that more nobles are entering the market. You can tell they're nobles because they're all wearing swords. They're starting to speculate and trade in tulips among them. You can see they're entering striped tulips. The little monkey in the upper right, he's saying, hey, I got tulips and I'm making a lot of money. You can see him holding the money bags. Scroll a little bit farther to the right, and you'll see this is the riffraff, you and me entering the picture, right? We're normal folks because we don't have swords. You can see that we're starting to speculate in bulbs. You can see all the money being thrown on the table. We're selling our possessions. We're mortgaging our houses, trying to get rich in this market. And then if we go further on to the lower right of this painting, you will see that the bottom finally falls out of the market. The monkey in the upper center is openly weeping into a handkerchief because they've lost everything they own. And yes, if you look very closely in the lower right-hand corner, that is a monkey literally urinating on his now worthless tulips because they are not worth anything. So, let's go back to our story again and summarize. Question is, what happened? What happened? What caused this bust? Why did the bubble burst? A few years ago in the US, we had a Fed chairman right before the 2008 recession named Alan Greenspan. And he coined a term, he called it irrational exuberance. And that's a fancy term for getting carried away with your emotions. Okay? A more concrete way to put it is this next bullet, which is that the price did not reflect the value. Now, something like a tulip, it does have a value. It is a flower, it is pretty. You could put it on a vase on your table, so it has a value. I would argue that that value is not 10 to 20 times somebody's annual salary. And when it reaches that point, the price no longer reflects the value. And so what happens at that point, as this next bullet explains, you have panic selling. As long as there are more people who want to buy than there is supply, then prices will go up because of demand. But if you have more people selling than you have people willing to buy, then the price goes down because everybody's trying to chase each other to the buyers. This is a normal part of economics. Now, in this particular case of Tulip Mania, the government did try to step in to make something happen. The government tried making all kinds of negotiations. They said, okay, we'll try to honor 10% of a contract. Okay, so if you had a contract, we'll give you 10 cents on the dollar for it. Well, considering some of these things were going for 10 times somebody's annual salary, that did not make anybody happy. If you paid 900,000 florins for a tulip, you don't want to get compensated 100,000 florins. You're still out hundreds of thousands of florins. So these government agreements made nobody happy. And in the end, the courts ruled that because all of these transactions took place in the backs of taverns, they essentially amounted to gambling, and none of these contracts was legally enforceable. So what you were left with was a flower or a bulb or a worthless piece of paper. Now, there was something going on at this time, which is that there was a bubonic plague going on in Haarlem, in that area of the Netherlands. Some people think that this contributed to the panic selling. Other people think that this actually contributed to the rise of tulips in the first place. Because if you're looking at the possibility of mortality and you may not be alive in the next day or month or year, you were more likely to take risks with your investments because you figured you had nothing to lose. And so some people think that this is what drove Tulip Mania up. Okay? So, after you leave this lecture, because a lot of you are very, very smart people, you're probably going to go out on Google and you're going to Google Tulip Mania and try and get more information. This is what you're going to find. Most of what we talk about in terms of Tulip Mania is based on a book that came out in the mid-1800s by Charles Mackay called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. That's a great title for a book. He talked about Tulip Mania, and he based his research on an earlier book from the late 1700s, which is this next book. And this was written by a guy named John Beckman. John Beckman is the one who came up with all those sales anecdotes and contracts that I shared during my highlights of the stories. And so for years, if you went to Econ 101 in college, you learned about Tulip Mania as the prime example of a bubble market. You can see here on this next slide some examples of articles that came out talking about Tulip Mania and market crashes and bubble markets. However, about 10 years ago, another book came out by a woman named Anne Goldgar called Tulip Mania, in which she argued that the whole thing was overblown. There really was no Tulip Mania, or if it was highly exaggerated. Her argument was that The economy did not collapse as a result of this, therefore, it couldn't have been that big a deal. And so if you look on Google, you'll see these kinds of articles that also come out that said there was never really a tulip fever, Tulip Mania was overblown, it was exaggerated, most of this stuff is not factually true. Well then, after that, more articles came out like this next one, which kind of debunked the debunkers. And what they said is, just because the economy did not collapse doesn't mean there wasn't a Tulip Mania. For instance, during the dot-com crash, the US didn't fail, but a lot of people lost a lot of money. During the Great Recession in 2008, the economy did not fail, but still a lot of people lost their houses. So just the fact that the Dutch economy did not fail does not mean that there was not a Tulip Mania, does not mean that a lot of people did not lose a lot of money. So I will leave it to you to do your own research, come up with your own conclusions. But what I can say is this, that there was a tulip market, there was a huge run-up in tulip prices, and there was a bottom that fell out of the tulip market, and a lot of people lost a lot of money. And as this next slide shows, Tulip Mania does follow what we now know as the classic shape of a bubble market. So let me explain this. It starts on the left, which is called the stealth phase, the smart money. These are the angel investors, the people way up front, the rich and famous who set trends. They establish the market, in this case in tulips. Then you have what's called the awareness phase, the institutional investors. These are like the venture capitalists who hop on the bandwagon and say, yes, there's a lot of money to be made on this. They are still able to get into the ground level. But these angels and VCs can only make their money when you and I enter the market during the mania phase. We're the ones who drive the price straight up skyrocket because there are so many of us and so many of us just chase the market. We're the ones who make it skyrocket, and this is when the smart money actually gets out and makes their profit. And we're left having bought at the upper end of the market, and then when the market crashes, as it happens during the blow-off phase, we're the ones who are left holding the bag. That is the classic shape of a bubble market. Now, what differentiates a bubble market from just normal prosperity in a rising market? Well, as this next quote from a Stanford economist says, a bubble market is where investors buy an asset, not for its fundamental value, but because they plan to resell at a higher price to the next investor. So you did not buy this tulip because you wanted a tulip. You bought this tulip because you planned to resell it to somebody else. As I mentioned, at this time during Tulip Mania, these people were very naive. They, again, did not necessarily know what they were doing. They did not even know what tulips were. They just thought they could make a lot of money. They thought that this market would never end. There would be a lot of prosperity. Today, you and I know what a bubble market is. We've been through the hard knocks, so we could never possibly let something like that happen to us in this modern age, correct? Well, let's look at the next graphic. Now, let me start off by saying I have nothing against Beanie Babies. I have nothing against people who bought Beanie Babies. Quite honestly, there was a lot of money to be made in Beanie Babies if you got in the market at the right time and you got out of the market at the right time, okay? As this next graphic shows, even at the height of the market, people were asking, is this the next Tulip Mania? Again, a Beanie Baby has a value. It is a cute little stuffed animal. It looks good sitting on your shelf. It's a nice toy for your baby to chew on. But is it worth some of the prices that were paid? As this next graphic shows, this is what the market looked like at its height, if you don't recall. These three Beanie Babies are called the American Trio. In 1998, you could sell the American Trio on eBay for $1,300. In 2018, you could get, for that same trio on eBay, $3. And again, if you have any interesting stories or insights to share that you're willing to share, please type them in the comments, and I'll be happy to share any that we have time to get to. One of the more famous stories of the Beanie Baby craze is this next article I'm going to show. There was a family, I certainly hope you're not online because I have nothing against you. There was a family who took their college education fund for their children, $100,000, and invested all of it in Beanie Babies because they thought they were going to make a fortune and their kids would be set for life. Unfortunately, they bought at the height of the market. And so today, as far as I know, they still have rooms and bins full of Beanie Babies, and their children got a different kind of education. Here's another example of a bubble market that's a little bit closer to modern times in this next slide. And again, let me start off by saying I have nothing against Bitcoin. I have nothing against people who invest in Bitcoin. There is a lot of money to be made in Bitcoin if you get in the market at the right time and you get out of the market at the right time. And again, if you have any interesting Bitcoin stories to share, I'd love to hear them. But as this next graph shows, this shows you how crazy Bitcoin is. This is a graph that explains if you took $100 and invested it at the times when things first became public, what would you have today? And again, let me wait for this graphic to paint. My clicker, oh, there we go. Okay, my clicker is now working. All right, so this curve on the far left, this slow, graceful red arc, that is Coca-Cola. If you invested $100 in Coca-Cola in 1919 and waited 100 years to 2019, that $100 would be worth $1 million. Pretty good payoff, right? Now let's look at that curve on the far right, the orange one that looks like it almost goes straight up vertically. That is Bitcoin. 10 years ago, if you had invested $100 in Bitcoin in 2009, today, that same amount of money would be worth $7 million in only 10 years, from $100 to $7 million. The trick is, today it's worth $7 million. Tomorrow it might be worth $10 million. Tomorrow it might be worth 50 cents. You don't know, because the whole thing with the bubble market is that it keeps going up and you never know when it's going to crash, and when it crashes suddenly. Okay, here's another perspective on the Bitcoin market. I'll show you another graph. In this graph, you look at that little blue jagged line at the very bottom. That is the price appreciation for tulips during Tulip Mania. That big black line, that is the relative rise in Bitcoin. It just dwarfs Tulip Mania. And as you can see, it's kind of down off its peak. Because of COVID-19, the price is starting to go back up. It's still fluctuating. Again, there is money to be made if you get in the market at the right time and you get out of the market at the right time. But even today with Bitcoin, as this next headline shows, people are coming out and saying, is this the next Tulip Mania? So let me leave you with this thought. Tulips, Beanie Babies, Bitcoin, all these other things that you see as bubble markets, somebody yesterday brought up, Pokemon cards. They all follow this same economic theory, which I call the greater fool theory, as this next graphic shows. The greater fool theory is based on 4 fundamental rules. Okay? The first rule is this, that when you buy, or when I buy in this market and enter this market early, I may not believe that what I am buying is useful. I may pay $100 for a tulip, knowing very well that this tulip is not worth $100. So why do I do so? Because of rule number 2. Rule number 2 says, let me wait for this to catch up, what I believe is that someone in the future will pay more for it than what I paid myself. I am willing to be a fool and pay $100 for this tulip, because I know that my friend Bob, I'm convinced that Bob is a bigger fool than I am, and that he will pay $200 for that same tulip. Why will Bob pay $200 for a tulip? Because he knows that his friend Richard is an even bigger fool than he is, and that Richard will pay $400 for this tulip. So that is rule number 3. The greater fool theory believes that somewhere out there is a bigger fool than you are, who will pay more for what you just bought than what you paid for it. But, and this is a huge but, you have to beware of the last rule, which is that at some point, there is going to be the last fool. And the whole trick is don't be that last fool. And so that's your lesson for today. On that happy note, I'm going to end my presentation. Thank you for enjoying it. We might have a few minutes to get to some questions. Let me see what I have here coming up online. Yes, a lot of people answering questions. Okay, let's see. Yes, okay. They pump out water. They remove land. Good grief, a lot of you, there's a lot of you active on this. Thank you so much. Okay, so page 2. Okay, were humble figurines a bubble market? Were humble figurines a bubble market? Well, the whole collectible market is based on appreciation, and I would call the collectibles market more akin to the stock market as opposed to a bubble, which may be more akin to a day trading market. So there is an investment market for collectibles where if you get something that is a limited edition, at some point it goes out of print and the value becomes more. But it's again always dependent on what somebody else is willing to pay for it. By virtue of the fact that it is speculation, it has the potential to become a bubble market. I would say that it is not going to have an astronomical price increase and then an astronomical bottom falling out of the market. It may be that it plateaus off or that it does not appreciate as much as you want to. So for collectibles, just my pure honest opinion, buy it because you like the way it looks and you think it's worth that much to put on your shelf. How's that? Okay, so here's a Beanie Baby story. This is from Janine in Baskin Ridge. I had bought 1,500 Beanie Babies, good for you, Janine, to help me teach Spanish in the 4th grade. After many years, I donated all of them to the Children's Hospital, to a secondhand shop raising money. All I could do was deduct it on my IRS return. Good for you. Okay, so Sandra in Columbus asks a very good question. Are we in a bubble in the stock market enhanced by the virus? Well, some people would argue that we are in a bubble in as much as the current price in stocks does not reflect the fundamental valuation rules like P&E that you normally would rate stock value on. So they are no longer seeing eye to eye. Now, is that a bubble because people are speculating simply because they think somebody will pay them more? Not necessarily. I would say that part of the problem with today's market is that there aren't a whole lot of alternatives to invest your money. You can't earn interest in the bank. Bonds aren't paying anything. Some people are hoarding gold, but stock markets amount to the major way to invest your money. And so that in and of itself may be driving the market out. A lot of the actions by the central banks, including the Fed, to prop up the economy are also making sure it goes up. And so that is in turn feeding the market. Okay, so let's see. I'm originally from Belgium, had never heard of Tulip Mania. Thank you very much, Janine. Okay, let's go back and see if we get any other. I'm getting a lot of wonderful comments, so thank you. Okay, if colors in tulips were so admired, why was Dutch dress so monochrome? This is from Gary. Gary is in Fort Thomas, and Gary is very, very special to me because I will go ahead and say it. Gary is the whole reason that I'm here on Viking.TV right now. Gary recommended to Viking that you put me on the air, so thank you again, Gary. Okay, so if colors in tulips were so admired, why was Dutch dress so monochrome? That has to do with Protestantism. And this is one of those great paradoxes of some religions, is that people felt that their dress should reflect plain folk. You are going to get to salvation through hard work by humbling yourself as opposed to being ostentatious. And so what you did not see a lot of was people wearing tulips. You saw people displaying tulips, and that's the paradox, is that yes, your personal appearance was supposed to be very, very humble, black and white. But as people got rich, they kind of like started getting sloppy and said, well, my house can show off nice things. My garden can show off nice things. My living room can show off nice things. So it was this general paradox. I'm sure we've seen analogs in today's modern market of people who say, I want to live a humble life, but then they go and buy a Tesla. So it's all in your personal values. Okay, so what else do we have here coming across? Okay, Cynthia in Lawrenceville. I know the tulip trade imploded, but were there any nobles who started to sell their contracts quickly, basically who had insight into what this market became and tried to exit as quickly as possible? Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. There were people who made money and got out, and in turn only spent what they could afford to lose. It's the same thing like, for instance, if you go to Vegas and you bet, and you only bet your winnings, and you never threatened the amount of money you came in with. Yeah, there were people who did not lose money. Now, again, because they did not have the bubble market and the shape of the bubble market, they did not know that there was this thing called the early phase and then the ramp up phase and stuff like that. So it really went down more to luck than anything else, of being in the right place at the right time. The thing that the smart people and the early investors did that the normal riffraff like you and me didn't do is, on that fateful day in February 5th, they got on their horse and they rode out of town as fast as possible. And they got to a town that hadn't heard of this yet, and they unloaded all their stuff. And they made money off the people like you and me who didn't know better. Okay? So, I keep being handed notes here by my wife. Okay, so Mike from Montclairny, or Mike from Montclairny says, we ate our tulips during World War II. I did not get sick, but my parents did. I'm very sorry to hear that. Fortunately, that was after the market bubble, and hopefully nobody chased you down the street and threw you in jail. Okay, so I do see a lot of wonderful comments going there. A lot of people got guessed these .com companies. Paul and Alexandria guessed Apple. Nancy guessed Google, Apple, and Amazon. Joanna guessed Amazon. Jerome and Huntsville guessed Apple, Amazon, and Facebook. Carol guessed Facebook and Amazon. So a lot of you got these right. Yes, they were all what we call FANG companies, or .com companies, internet companies that have just taken off as a result of COVID and the lockdown, because people have nothing to do but shop and watch television online. So I see we are running over time. If there are any more questions that come in, I will be happy to address them. But what I want to do is I want to take a couple of minutes and thank a lot of people. There are a lot of people who behind the scenes make this show what it is and bring you Viking.TV. But even more than that, I want to thank all of you, because you're the whole reason we exist here with Viking.TV. I see a lot of comments coming in, not just questions, but feedback and positive reinforcement. Thank you so much for that. Please keep submitting your comments. In addition to me, there is literally an entire team of Viking people who read each and every comment you do, you submit, and make changes and improvements based on that. You know, I mentioned my friend Gary, who made a suggestion to put me on the air, and here I am. If you want to see more programs like this, let Viking know. If you want to see fewer programs like this, let Viking know. They will listen to you, but they will take your feedback, and you will help make this an even better company. Okay? So, before I leave, I do want to say one more thing. I've just been passed another note that apparently this is Viking's 23rd birthday. So happy birthday to Viking. All of you, I hope to see you soon back aboard ship, where we can share even more of these wonderful stories and exchange voice to voice and face to face. In the meantime, I wish you a wonderful day. Enjoy your Arts and Music Wednesday, and come back to Viking.TV real soon. Take care.